On the bustling streets of the city, where the noise of cars and the hustle of people created an urban symphony, lived Jack, a man in his 40s whose life had taken a dramatic turn. Just a few years ago, Jack was a successful businessman, but a series of bad investments and a painful separation had left him with nothing. Now he lived on the streets with his daughter Emily, a sweet and intelligent 10-year-old girl who was his only reason to keep going. Despite the difficulties, Jack strived to give Emily the best life possible every day. He scoured the city looking for odd jobs and handouts, always hoping to be able to offer his daughter a better future. Emily, for her part, was a resilient child who faced her situation with a maturity beyond her years, always with a smile on her face and words of encouragement for her father. One autumn afternoon, as Jack and Emily were walking through the elegant Maple Grove neighborhood, they heard a commotion coming from a luxury restaurant. An elegantly dressed elderly woman was being escorted out of the establishment by two waiters, who seemed very uncomfortable with the situation. "This is outrageous," exclaimed the elderly woman indignantly. "I've been a customer of this restaurant for decades. You can't treat me like this just because I forgot my wallet." Jack, moved by a surge of compassion, approached the scene. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the waiters. "What seems to be the problem?" One of the waiters, visibly embarrassed, explained, "The lady can't pay her bill, and we're obligated to ask her to leave." Jack looked at the elderly woman who, despite her indignation, maintained a dignity and elegance that spoke of a life of refinement. Without thinking twice, Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out the few bills he had collected that day. "I'll pay the lady's bill," he said firmly. The waiters and the elderly woman looked at him in astonishment. Emily tugged at her father's sleeve, whispering, "Dad, are you sure? It's all we have." Jack smiled at his daughter and nodded. "Sometimes, Emily, we have to do the right thing even when it's not easy." The elderly woman, moved by the gesture, introduced herself. "Young man, your kindness has left me speechless. Please allow me to invite you and your charming daughter for tea at my house. It's the least I can do to thank you." Jack hesitated for a moment, but the warmth in the elderly woman's eyes and Emily's hopeful look convinced him he accepted the invitation, and together they headed to the woman's mansion in the heart of Maple Grove. The elderly woman's residence was an impressive manor house with a lush garden and a facade that spoke of more glorious times. As they took tea in the elegant living room, the woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, shared stories of her life full of travels and adventures. Emily listened, fascinated, her eyes shining with each anecdote. Suddenly, the living room door opened, and a young man in his mid-30s, dressed in a white doctor's coat, entered. "Grandma, are you all right? They called me from the restaurant and—" He stopped short upon seeing Jack and Emily. Mrs. Thompson smiled and said, "Ah, Michael, how good of you to come. Let me introduce you to my saviors. This is Jack and his adorable daughter, Emily." Michael, Mrs. Thompson's grandson, listened in amazement to the account of what had happened at the restaurant. He looked at Jack with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for my grandmother," he said sincerely. Jack, uncomfortable with so much attention, tried to downplay the matter. "Anyone would have done the same," he mumbled, but Michael wasn't about to let it go. "No, not anyone. What you've done is extraordinary, especially considering, well, your current situation." There was an awkward moment of silence. Emily, sensing the tension, intervened. "Dr. Michael is right, Dad. You are extraordinary." The child's words broke the ice, and everyone laughed. Michael, impressed by Emily's maturity, began to ask her questions about her studies and her dreams. To his surprise, he discovered that the girl had a keen interest in medicine. "You know, I'm giving some talks at schools about basic health," said Michael. "If your father agrees, would you like to attend one?" Emily's eyes lit up with excitement. She looked at her father pleadingly. Jack, though hesitant, couldn't resist the joy on his daughter's face. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt," he conceded. And so what began as a selfless act of kindness became the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Jack and Emily began to visit Mrs. Thompson and Michael regularly, finding in them not only support but also a connection that none of them expected. As the weeks passed, Michael found himself increasingly intrigued by Jack. There was something about the dignity with which he faced his situation in his devotion to his daughter that resonated deeply with him. For his part, Jack found in Michael not only a brilliant doctor, but a compassionate and unprejudiced man. One day, while Emily was attending one of Michael's talks, Jack and Mrs. Thompson were conversing in the garden. The elderly woman, with the wisdom that only years can bring, looked at Jack and said, "You know, young man, life sometimes puts trials before us that seem impossible to overcome. But it's those trials that reveal our true strength." Jack, moved by Mrs. Thompson's words, felt that for the first time in a long time, he could let his guard down. With a choked voice, he shared his story. How he had lost everything. How his wife had abandoned him, taking everything that was left of his fortune, leaving him alone with Emily. Mrs. Thompson listened in silence, her eyes full of compassion. When Jack finished, she took his hand and said, "My dear Jack, you have faced storms that would have sunk many, but here you are, fighting every day for your daughter. That speaks of an inner strength that few possess." Meanwhile, at Michael's talk, Emily was absorbing every word with fascination. Her agile mind asked questions that surprised even the older students. Michael, impressed by the child's intelligence and curiosity, found himself thinking about the wasted potential due to Jack and Emily's circumstances. At the end of the talk, while waiting for Jack to come pick up Emily, Michael made a decision. "Emily," he said, "would you like to come more often? I could give you some private science lessons." The girl almost jumped with excitement, but then her face fell. "I'd love to, Dr. Michael, but I don't think we can afford it." Michael smiled warmly. "Don't worry about that. Consider it an exchange. You help me prepare my talks and I teach you. What do you say?" When Jack arrived and Emily told him about Michael's proposal, the man felt overwhelmed by the generosity he wanted to refuse, his pride battling against necessity. But seeing the hope in his daughter's eyes, he couldn't say no. Thus, without knowing it, a network of relationships was being woven that would change everyone's lives. Jack and Emily had found not just friends, but a chosen family. And although the road ahead was still full of challenges, for the first time in a long time, there was a ray of hope on their horizon. What none of them could imagine was how this new connection would be tested in the coming months, and how an act of kindness would trigger a series of events that would test the limits of love, loyalty, and forgiveness. The months passed, and the friendship between Jack, Emily, Mrs. Thompson, and Michael grew stronger. Occasional visits became a routine, and the mansion in Maple Grove became a second home for Jack, and his daughter Michael, true to his word, began giving Emily private lessons. Amazed each day by how quickly the girl absorbed knowledge, Jack, for his part, found in Mrs. Thompson a confidant and mentor. The elderly woman's wisdom and unshakable optimism were a balm for his wounded soul. Little by little, Jack began to regain confidence in himself and in the future. One day, while helping Mrs. Thompson in the garden, Jack dared to share an idea that had been on his mind. "Mrs. Thompson," he began hesitantly, "I've been thinking, do you think it would be crazy if I tried to start over? You know, in business?" The elderly woman put down her watering can and looked at Jack with a warm smile. "My dear, it's never crazy to try to improve. Tell me, what do you have in mind?" Jack told her about a small grocery store that was for sale in the neighborhood. The owner, an elderly man who knew Jack from his days on the street, had offered to sell it to him at a very low price and with easy payment terms. "It's a unique opportunity," said Jack, "but I'm afraid, what if I fail again? I can't risk Emily's future." Mrs. Thompson took Jack's hands in hers. "Fear is natural, Jack. But remember, true failure isn't in falling, but in not getting up. And you, my dear friend, have demonstrated time and time again your ability to get back up." Encouraged by Mrs. Thompson's words, Jack decided to take the plunge with Michael's help, who lent him the money for the initial payment. Jack became the proud owner of Jack's Corner, a small but cozy grocery store. The first months were difficult. Jack worked from dawn to dusk, learning on the go the ins and outs of the business. Emily, always willing to help, took care of the cash, register after school. Michael and Mrs. Thompson took turns caring for Emily when Jack had to make deliveries or negotiate with suppliers. Little by little, Jack's corner began to gain clientele. Jack's kindness and honesty in business earned him the trust of the neighborhood. Soon, the store became a meeting point for neighbors who appreciated not only the fresh products, but also the warm attention from Jack and Emily. One day, while Jack was organizing the inventory, he heard a scream coming from the street. He ran out and saw Emily on the ground, holding her arm with a pained expression. She had tripped while playing with some friends and had fallen on the sidewalk. Jack, seized by panic, immediately called Michael. The young doctor arrived within minutes, examined Emily, and determined that she needed an urgent X-ray. Without thinking twice, Michael took them to the hospital where he worked. While waiting for the results, Jack couldn't stop blaming himself. "I should have been more attentive," he lamented. "If I hadn't been so busy with the store." Michael put a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Accidents happen, friend. Don't blame yourself. The important thing is that we're here, and Emily is getting the attention she needs." Finally, the diagnosis came. Emily had a fracture in her arm that required a small surgical intervention. Jack paled at hearing the word surgery, but Michael reassured him, explaining the procedure step by step. "I'll perform the operation myself," Michael assured. "I promise I'll take care of Emily as if she were my own daughter." The surgery was a success, and Emily recovered quickly. During her stay in the hospital, the girl became the favorite of the nurses, captivated by her intelligence and sweetness. Even in adversity, Emily found reasons to smile, spreading her optimism to everyone around her. This incident strengthened the bond between the two families even more. Jack realized that despite the difficulties, he was no longer alone. He had a support network, people who cared about him and Emily, who were willing to help in the most difficult moments. One afternoon, while Emily was resting at home after being discharged, Mrs. Thompson arrived for a visit with a box full of old medical books. "I thought our little doctor-to-be might like something to read while she recovers," she said with an affectionate smile. Emily's eyes lit up at the sight of the books. Despite the cast on her arm, she managed to flip through the pages with enthusiasm. "Mrs. Thompson, they're wonderful!" Jack watched the scene with a mixture of gratitude and emotion. Seeing his daughter so happy, surrounded by people who loved her, filled his heart with a joy he hadn't felt in a long time. While Emily immersed herself in the books, Mrs. Thompson sat next to Jack in the small living room. "How are you, dear?" she asked gently. Jack sighed. "I'm overwhelmed," he admitted. "Grateful but overwhelmed. Sometimes I wonder if I deserve all this kindness." Mrs. Thompson took his hand firmly. "Jack, kindness is not something that is deserved or not. It's something that is given freely. And you, my dear friend, have given much more than you have received." Those words sank deep into Jack. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps, just perhaps, things really could get better. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Jack's store prospered. Emily recovered completely and continued her studies with renewed passion, and the friendship between the two families became unbreakable. However, fate had one more test prepared for this united group. One spring afternoon, while Jack was closing the store, he received a call from Michael the Young. Doctor's voice trembled on the other end of the line. "Jack, it's Grandma. She's had an accident." The world seemed to stop for Jack without thinking. Twice he closed the store and ran to the hospital with Emily. Upon arrival, they found Michael in the waiting room, pale-faced and red-eyed. "A drunk driver," Michael began, his voice breaking. "She was crossing the street and—" Jack hugged his friend, offering the same comfort he had once received Emily, showing maturity beyond her years, took Michael's hand and said firmly, "Mrs. Thompson is strong. She's going to be okay." The hours passed slowly. Michael, despite being a doctor, couldn't participate in his grandmother's treatment due to his personal relationship. He paced the waiting room, alternating between frustration and despair. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a doctor came out to talk to them. Mrs. Thompson had survived the surgery, but her condition was critical. The next 48 hours would be crucial. In the days that followed, Jack and Emily practically moved into the hospital. They took turns being with Michael, making sure he ate and rested, even if only for brief moments. The store was left in charge of a trusted neighbor, as Jack knew his place was, with the family that had taken him in during his darkest moments. It was during those long nights of vigil that Jack and Michael deepened their friendship even further. They shared stories of their lives, their deepest fears, and their most cherished dreams. Michael spoke of the pressure he felt as a doctor, how sometimes he doubted if he was living up to his grandmother's expectations. Jack, for his part, shared his fears about the future, his desire to give Emily the life she deserved, and his fear of failing again. One night, while Emily slept curled up in a chair, Michael looked at Jack with eyes full of emotion. "You know, when I first saw you at Grandma's house, I thought you were just a man down on his luck. But now I know you're one of the strongest and bravest men I've ever met." Jack, surprised by the declaration, didn't know what to say. Michael continued, "You've faced adversities that would have broken many, and yet here you are, being a pillar of strength for all of us. Thank you, Jack. Thank you for being part of our family." Those words touched the deepest part of Jack's heart. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to cry. Releasing years of repressed pain and loneliness, Michael hugged him in silence, offering the comfort that only a true friend can give. After 5 days of uncertainty, Mrs. Thompson finally woke up. Although weak, her indomitable spirit shone in her eyes. The first thing she did upon seeing everyone gathered in her room was smile and say, "Well, it seems I've caused quite a commotion." Mrs. Thompson's recovery was slow but steady. During that time, the dynamic between the two families solidified even more. Jack and Emily took turns caring for the elderly woman, reading her favorite books to her and keeping her up to date with neighborhood gossip. One day, while Jack was helping Mrs. Thompson walk through the hospital garden, the elderly woman stopped and looked at him seriously. "Jack, I want you to know something. Since you came into our lives, you've brought a light we didn't know we were missing. You and Emily are the family I always wished for. Michael." Jack moved, tried to speak, but Mrs. Thompson interrupted him. "Let me finish. Dear, life is unpredictable, as we've clearly seen, but there's one thing I'm sure of. No matter what happens, you'll always have a home with us." Those words sealed a silent pact between them. They were no longer just friends. They were family. A family forged not by blood, but by love, loyalty, and mutual compassion. As Mrs. Thompson recovered, life seemed to smile on everyone. Jack's store thrived, Emily excelled in her studies, and her passion for medicine grew day by day. Michael found a new purpose in his work, inspired by his grandmother's resilience and Jack's determination. However, fate still had more trials in store for this unconventional family, trials that would test the bonds they had forged and reveal the true depth of their connection. What none of them could imagine was that the greatest challenge was yet to come, a challenge that would shake the very foundations of their relationship and force them to face uncomfortable truths about themselves and those they loved. Time passed, and life seemed to have found a harmonious balance for Jack, Emily, Michael, and Mrs. Thompson. Jack's store had become a thriving business. Emily excelled at school and spent more and more time at the hospital with Michael, learning about medicine, and Mrs. Thompson, although more fragile after her accident, remained the heart and soul of the family. However, as often happens, the calm preceded the storm. It all began on a summer afternoon. Emily, now a 15-year-old teenager, was helping Jack in the store when she suddenly fainted. Jack, seized by panic, immediately took her to the hospital where Michael worked. After a series of tests, Michael came out of the emergency room with a grave expression. "Jack," he said in a tense voice, "we need to talk." The diagnosis was devastating. Emily had a congenital heart condition that had never been detected before. She needed urgent and complex surgery. Jack felt the world crumbling around him. "How is this possible?" he asked with a trembling voice. "She's always been so healthy, so strong." Michael put a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Sometimes these conditions don't show symptoms until they do. The important thing now is to act quickly." The following days were a whirlwind of medical consultations, examinations, and preparations for the surgery. Jack barely slept, dividing his time between the hospital and the store, which now seemed insignificant compared to his daughter's health. The night before the surgery, Jack sat next to Emily's hospital bed. The young girl, pale but determined, took her father's hand. "Dad," she said, with a maturity that made Jack's heart ache, "I want you to know that I'm proud of you, of everything you've done for me." Jack fought back tears. "My girl," he whispered, "you are my strength. You always have been." The surgery lasted for hours that seemed like eternities. Jack, Michael, and Mrs. Thompson waited in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts and prayers. Finally, the surgeon came out of the operating room. The operation had been a success, but Emily would need time and intensive care to recover completely. Days turned into weeks. Emily, always resilient, faced her recovery with determination. Michael practically moved into the hospital, personally overseeing every aspect of Emily's care. It was during this time that Jack noticed something: the way Michael looked at Emily, his gestures, the concern that went beyond professional duty. He realized that the young doctor was developing feelings for his daughter. At first, Jack didn't know how to react. Michael was his best friend, a man he trusted completely, but Emily was his little girl, and the age difference between them was considerable. One night, while sharing a coffee in the hospital cafeteria, Jack decided to address the issue. "Michael," he began cautiously, "I've noticed how you look at Emily." The young doctor visibly tensed. "Jack, I don't know what to say. I know it's inappropriate, that she's very young, that I'm your friend, but I can't help what I feel." Jack remained silent for a moment, processing his friend's words. Finally, he spoke. "Michael, I trust you more than anyone in this world. I know you're an honorable man, but Emily is young, vulnerable. I need you to promise me that you won't act on these feelings, at least not until she's older and can make her own decisions." Michael nodded solemnly. "I promise, Jack. I'll respect Emily and our friendship above all else." This silent pact between the two men marked a turning point in their relationship. Although they remained close friends, there was a new underlying tension, a shared secret that weighed on both of them. Meanwhile, Emily continued her recovery, oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. Her determination and positive spirit inspired everyone in the hospital. She even began to help other young patients, sharing her experience and providing emotional support. Weeks later, Emily was finally discharged. The homecoming was a moment of celebration for everyone. Mrs. Thompson organized a small party at her mansion, gathering friends and neighbors to welcome Emily home. During the party, as Emily laughed and chatted with her friends, Jack found himself observing his daughter with new eyes. She was no longer the little girl he had protected for so many years. She was becoming a strong and compassionate young woman. Michael, true to his promise, maintained a respectful distance during the celebration, although Jack could see the longing in his eyes every time he looked at Emily. That night, after everyone had gone and Emily was asleep, Jack sat on the small balcony of his apartment above the store. Mrs. Thompson, who had stayed to help with the cleanup, joined him. "You seem worried, dear," said the elderly woman with her usual perceptiveness. Jack sighed. "How do you know when it's time to let go?" Mrs. Thompson smiled wisely. "Ah, the eternal question of every parent. Jack, letting go doesn't mean abandoning. It means trusting that you've given your daughter the tools to fly on her own." "But what if she makes mistakes, if she gets hurt?" Jack asked. "Mistakes are part of life, dear, and wounds teach us to be stronger. Your job isn't to prevent Emily from experiencing life, but to be there to support her when she needs it." Mrs. Thompson's words resonated with Jack. He realized that his greatest challenge wouldn't be overcoming poverty or material difficulties, but learning to let go of his daughter, to allow her to grow and make her own decisions. What Jack didn't know was that the universe had more tests prepared for him and his chosen family, tests that would challenge their love, their loyalty, and their capacity to forgive. In the months that followed, life seemed to find a new rhythm Emily returned to. School, more determined than ever to pursue her dream of becoming a doctor. Jack focused on expanding his business, opening a second store in another neighborhood. Michael continued his work at the hospital, keeping his promise to respect Emily, although each day it became harder for him to hide his feelings. Mrs. Thompson, always observant, noticed the growing tension between the members of her chosen family, but wisely decided not to intervene, trusting that time and love would resolve things. However, fate had other plans. One autumn afternoon, as Emily was returning from school, the unthinkable happened. A car, driven by a distracted driver, veered off the road and onto the sidewalk where Emily was walking. The impact was devastating. The news reached Jack like a bolt from the blue. He was in the store when he received the call from the hospital. Without thinking, he closed the business and ran there, his mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation. Upon arrival, he found Michael in the emergency room, pale-faced and with trembling hands. "She's in surgery," he said, his voice breaking. It's serious." The following hours were an endless nightmare. Jack, Michael, and Mrs. Thompson waited in tense silence, interrupted only by whispered prayers and muffled sobs. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the surgeon came out to talk to them. Emily had survived the surgery, but she was in a coma. The damage was extensive, and her recovery, if it occurred, would be long and difficult. Jack felt the world collapsing around him. "My girl, my Emily," he murmured, unable to process the news. Michael, acting more as a doctor than a friend, began to ask questions about the treatment and prognosis. Mrs. Thompson, for her part, hugged Jack, offering the silent comfort that only a mother can give. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Emily remained in a coma, her young body struggling to heal. Jack practically moved into the hospital, sleeping in a chair next to his daughter's bed, constantly talking to her, begging her to wake up. Michael immersed himself in his work, tirelessly researching new treatments and therapies that could help Emily. His dedication went beyond professional duty, and everyone in the hospital could see the love that motivated his efforts. It was during this time of crisis that the relationship between Jack and Michael began to strain. Jack, consumed by pain and worry, often became irritable and distrustful, questioning every medical decision, every proposed treatment. Michael, for his part, struggled to maintain professional objectivity, but his love for Emily often clouded his judgment. One night, after a particularly heated argument about a new experimental treatment, Jack exploded. "You don't understand," he shouted at Michael. "She's my daughter, my reason for living. How can you be so calm, so clinical about all this?" Michael, hurt by his friend's words, responded with brutal honesty. "You think I don't care? I love her, Jack. I love her more than I've ever loved anyone. Every day that passes without her waking up is torture for me too." The silence that followed this confession was deafening. Jack, stunned by the revelation, didn't know how to react. Michael, realizing what he had just admitted, hurriedly left the room. Mrs. Thompson, who had witnessed the exchange, approached Jack. "Love," she said softly, "sometimes comes in unexpected ways and at inopportune moments, but that doesn't make it any less real or valuable." Jack spent the night reflecting on Mrs. Thompson's words and Michael's confession. He realized that in his pain, he had been pushing away the people who most wanted to help Emily. The next day, he sought out Michael to apologize. He found him in the hospital chapel, his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," Jack said simply. Michael looked up, his eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. "I'm sorry too," he responded. "I never wanted. I know it's inappropriate, that she's very young, that I'm your friend, but I can't change what I feel." Jack sat down next to him. "Michael, you're the most honorable man I know. When Emily wakes up, if she chooses to be with you, you'll have my blessing." This conversation marked a new chapter in their friendship. Together, they renewed their efforts to help Emily, each contributing their unique strengths. Jack with his unconditional love and constant presence, Michael with his medical knowledge and tireless dedication. Meanwhile, in the world outside the hospital, life went on. Jack's store, now managed by trusted employees, continued to thrive. Neighbors and friends took turns visiting, offering support and keeping hope alive. It was during this period that Jack met Alex, Emily's boyfriend. The young man, devastated by the accident, visited the hospital regularly. Jack, in his grief, had barely noticed his presence before, but now he began to pay attention to the boy his daughter had chosen. Alex was a brilliant student, kind, and deeply in love with Emily. He shared stories with Jack about their relationship, about the dreams and plans they had made together. These conversations were bittersweet for Jack, a reminder of everything Emily was missing while she lay unconscious one day while Alex was visiting. Emily's monitors began to show changes. For a moment, everyone held their breath, hoping it was the sign they had been waiting for months. But the hope faded as quickly as it had come. The doctors explained that it was just a normal fluctuation, not a sign that Emily was waking up. That night, after everyone had gone, Jack stayed alone with his daughter. He took her inert hand and, for the first time since the accident, allowed the tears to flow freely. "My girl," he sobbed, "I need you, we all need you, please come back to us." What Jack didn't know was that his plea would be the catalyst for a chain of events that would change their lives forever. Events that would test their love, their loyalty, and their capacity to forgive in ways he could never have imagined. The miracle they had all been waiting for finally occurred on a spring morning, almost a year after the accident. Jack was in his usual vigil by Emily's bed when he noticed a slight movement in her fingers. At first he thought it was his imagination playing tricks on him, as it had so many times before. But then Emily's eyes began to flutter. "Doctor!" Jack shouted, his voice a mixture of disbelief and hope. "Michael, someone! Emily's waking up!" The next few minutes were a whirlwind of activity. Doctors and nurses flooded the room, performing tests and checks. Michael, who had been doing rounds on another floor, came running in, breathless and with eyes shining with emotion. Slowly, Emily opened her eyes fully. Her gaze, confused at first, focused on Jack. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "What happened?" Jack, crying with joy, took his daughter's hand. "You're okay, my girl. You're back with us." The following days were of cautious celebration. Emily was awake, but her recovery was just beginning. She had lost muscle mass during her long coma and would need intensive physical therapy. Additionally, her short-term memory had been affected, and she often became confused about recent events. It was during this recovery period that Jack noticed something strange in Alex's behavior. The young man, who had been a constant presence during Emily's coma, now seemed distant and nervous. His visits became less frequent and shorter. Jack, concerned about his daughter's emotional well-being, decided to talk to Alex. He found him one day in the hospital cafeteria, distractedly looking at his phone. "Alex," Jack said, sitting across from him, "is everything okay? Emily has noticed that you don't come as often." The young man looked up, and Jack saw guilt in his eyes. "Mr. Jack," Alex began, his voice trembling slightly, "I don't know how to say this." Jack felt a knot forming in his stomach. "What's going on, son?" he asked, fearing the answer. Alex took a deep breath. "During Emily's coma, I met someone else. It wasn't intentional, it just happened. I feel terrible, but I can't keep pretending." Jack was speechless for a moment, processing the information. On one hand, he understood that a year was a long time, especially for someone as young as Alex. On the other hand, the idea that someone could abandon Emily in her moment of greatest need filled him with rage. "I understand," Jack finally said, his voice cold. "But I hope you understand that you can't just disappear. Emily deserves an explanation." Alex nodded, tears in his eyes. "I know I came today to talk to her, but I couldn't find the courage." Jack stood up, looking at the young man with a mixture of disappointment and compassion. "Find that courage. Alex, Emily deserves the truth, as painful as it may be." As Jack returned to Emily's room, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. How was he going to protect his daughter from this new pain? How could he help her overcome not only her physical recovery, but also this emotional betrayal? Upon entering the room, he saw Emily chatting animatedly with Michael. The young woman was smiling, her eyes bright in a way Jack hadn't seen in a long time. Michael, for his part, looked at her with a mixture of love and professional concern. At that moment, Jack made a decision. He wouldn't tell Emily about Alex, at least not now. His daughter needed to focus on her recovery. She needed positivity and support. The truth about Alex would only hurt her and could delay her progress. "Everything okay, Dad?" Emily asked, noticing her father's worried expression. Jack forced a smile. "Everything's perfect, my girl. I was just thinking about how lucky we are to have you back with us." Michael looked at Jack, curiously, noticing that something wasn't quite right, but decided not to press the issue at that moment. The following days were a challenge for Jack. Every time Emily asked about Alex, he invented excuses, that he was busy with university, that he had to travel for family matters, anything to avoid the painful truth. Michael, sensing that something was wrong, confronted Jack one night after Emily had fallen asleep. "Jack, what's going on? I know you're hiding something." Jack, exhausted by the weight of his secret, finally broke down. He told Michael about Alex's betrayal and his decision to hide the truth from Emily. Michael listened in silence, his expression a mixture of understanding and concern. When Jack finished, he said softly, "I understand why you're doing this, but lying to Emily isn't the solution. Sooner or later she'll discover the truth, and when she does, she'll feel betrayed not only by Alex, but by you too." Jack knew Michael was right, but the fear of hurting his daughter was stronger. "I just need a little more time," he said, "until she's stronger, more prepared to face this." Michael nodded, although he didn't fully agree. "All right, but don't wait too long. Emily is stronger than you think." What neither of them knew was that their words had been overheard. Mrs. Thompson, who had come to visit Emily and had fallen asleep in a chair in the hallway, had woken up just in time to hear the conversation. The elderly woman, with her years of wisdom, knew that this secret would only bring more pain in the long run. Meanwhile, Emily continued her recovery, oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. Each day she showed improvements. Her physical strength increased, her memory improved, and her indomitable spirit shone brighter than ever. But fate, as always, had its own plans. One afternoon, while Emily was browsing social media on her phone, an activity that doctors had allowed as part of her cognitive therapy, she came across something that would change everything. It was a photo of Alex, smiling happily with a girl Emily didn't. Recognize the caption of the image read, "6 months with the love of my life." Emily's cry of anguish resonated throughout the hospital floor. Jack, who was talking to a nurse in the hallway, ran towards the room, his heart pounding. As he entered, he saw his daughter crying inconsolably, the phone still in her trembling hand. "Emily, what's wrong?" Jack asked, although deep down he already knew the answer. Between sobs, Emily showed him the phone screen. "Alex, how could he?" Jack felt the world crumbling around him. Everything he had feared, everything he had tried to avoid, was happening in the worst possible way. He took his daughter in his arms, letting her cry on his shoulder as she had when she was little. "I'm so sorry, my girl," he whispered, his own voice breaking. Emily suddenly pulled away, looking at her father with a mixture of pain and suspicion. You knew?" Jack lowered his gaze, unable to lie anymore. Yes, I knew. Alex told me a few weeks ago I wanted to protect you, to give you time to recover before..." "Before what?" Emily interrupted, her voice now filled with anger. "Before telling me that the man I loved had betrayed me, that while I was fighting for my life, he was building a new one with someone else?" At that moment, Michael entered the room, alarmed by the commotion. Seeing the scene, he immediately understood what had happened. "Emily, Michael began." "You knew too?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Michael nodded slowly, guilt evident on his face. "I'm sorry, Emily. We wanted to protect you." Emily looked at the two men, the two people she trusted most, and felt her world crumbling for the second time. "Get out," she said with a calmness that contrasted with the storm in her eyes. "Both of you get out of my room now." Jack tried to approach his daughter, but she rejected him. "Please, Dad, I need to be alone." With broken hearts, Jack and Michael left the room. In the hallway, they met Mrs. Thompson, who had heard all the commotion. "Oh, my dears," said the elderly woman sadly, "the road to hell is paved with good intentions." The days that followed were hell for everyone. Emily refused to talk to Jack or Michael, barely tolerating their presence when it was necessary for her medical treatment. The young woman sank into a depression that threatened to delay her physical recovery. Jack was devastated. He saw how his daughter suffered and knew that much of that suffering was his fault. He spent hours sitting outside Emily's room, waiting for an opportunity to talk to her, to explain himself, to ask for forgiveness. Michael, for his part, immersed himself in his work, tormented by guilt and the pain of seeing the woman he loved suffer. He knew he had betrayed Emily's trust and feared he had lost any chance of a relationship with her. It was Mrs. Thompson who finally made a breakthrough. One afternoon, she entered Emily's room with a tray of tea and homemade cookies. "My child," she said softly, "can we talk?" Emily, who had rejected everyone else, couldn't refuse the sweet elderly woman. She nodded silently. Mrs. Thompson sat next to the bed and took Emily's hand. "You know, when I was young, I believed that love was simple, that it was all about grand gestures and unbridled passions. But over the years, I learned that true love is complicated. Sometimes it hurts, sometimes it makes us make mistakes." Emily listened in silence, tears running down her cheeks. "Your father and Michael," Mrs. Thompson continued, "made a mistake, big mistake, but they did it out of love. Perhaps misunderstood love, but love nonetheless." "They lied to me," Emily whispered. "I trusted them, and they lied to me." "Yes, they did," Mrs. Thompson nodded. "And they'll have to earn your trust again. But my child, don't you think they deserve at least the chance to explain themselves?" Emily remained silent for a long moment, considering the elderly woman's words. Finally, with a trembling sigh, she nodded. "Okay, I'll talk to them." Mrs. Thompson smiled tenderly and kissed Emily's forehead. "That's my brave girl. Remember, forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the greatest strength we can have." That night, Emily had long and painful conversations with Jack and Michael. There were tears, choked sobs, and finally a tacit understanding. Forgiveness wouldn't come overnight, but there was hope. In the days and weeks that followed, Emily focused on her recovery with renewed determination. Alex's betrayal still hurt, but she refused to let it define her. Jack and Michael, for their part, strove to rebuild the trust they had lost, supporting Emily in every step of her recovery. Little by little, the dynamic between them began to change. Emily started to see Michael not just as her father's friend or her doctor, but as a man who supported her unconditionally. And Michael, although trying to maintain a professional distance, couldn't help but feel his feelings for Emily grow each day. Jack observed this evolution with mixed emotions. On one hand, he was glad to see his daughter smile again, regain her spark. On the other hand, the idea that his best friend and his daughter might be developing feelings for each other filled him with unease. One night, while Emily was sleeping, Jack and Michael had a conversation. In the hospital cafeteria, Jack began cautiously, "I've noticed how you look at Emily." Michael visibly tensed. "Jack, let me finish," Jack interrupted. "I know you love her. I've known it for a long time, and I think she's starting to feel something for you too." Michael looked at his friend with a mixture of hope and fear. "And that bothers you?" Jack sighed deeply. "It scares me. Emily is my little girl. She always will be. But I also know that she's an adult woman capable of making her own decisions, and if she chooses you, well, I couldn't ask for a better man for her." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Jack. Your blessing means more than I can express." The two men hugged, sealing a new understanding between them. What neither of them knew was that this moment of understanding would be put to the test in the most unexpected way. Because while they were talking, an old acquaintance was making plans that would shake the foundations of their lives once again. Alex, consumed by guilt and remorse, had decided that he needed to see Emily one last time to apologize and seek forgiveness. What he didn't know was that his reappearance would trigger a series of events that would test the love, loyalty, and forgiveness of everyone involved in a way that none of them could have imagined. Spring was giving way to summer, and with the change of season, Emily's life seemed to be blossoming anew. Her physical recovery was progressing steadily, and emotionally, although still hurt by Alex's betrayal, she was beginning to find a new inner strength. Jack watched with a mixture of pride and nostalgia as his daughter transformed. She was no longer the little girl who needed his constant protection, but a strong and resilient young woman. And along with this transformation, he also noticed how the relationship between Emily and Michael was evolving, moving from a close friendship to something deeper and more significant. One afternoon, while Emily was doing her physical therapy in the hospital garden, Jack found himself alone with Mrs. Thompson. "She's blossoming, isn't she?" commented the elderly woman, watching Emily with affection. Jack nodded. "Yes, she is. Sometimes I wonder if she still needs me." Mrs. Thompson took Jack's hand in hers. "Oh, my dear, a daughter always needs her father, just in different ways as she grows." Before Jack could respond, they noticed a commotion at the garden entrance. To their surprise and consternation, they saw Alex standing there looking nervous and out of place. Jack immediately stood up, placing himself protectively between Alex and Emily. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a tense voice. Alex, visibly uncomfortable, responded, I need to talk to Emily. Please, just a few minutes." Before Jack could answer, Emily's voice was heard behind him. "It's okay, Dad. I want to hear what he has to say." Jack turned, surprised by the calmness in his daughter's voice. Emily approached, leaning slightly on her cane, her face a mask of serenity that contrasted with the storm in her eyes. "Alex," she said in a controlled voice, "let's talk." Jack reluctantly stepped aside, allowing Emily and Alex to sit on a nearby bench. He and Mrs. Thompson remained at a respectful distance, but close enough to intervene if necessary. The conversation between Emily and Alex was intense and emotional. Tears were shed, apologies offered, explanations given. From where he stood, Jack couldn't hear the exact words, but he could see both of their body language. Emily's defensive posture that gradually relaxed, Alex's repentant attitude. After what seemed like an eternity, Alex stood up, bowed respectfully to Emily, and left Emily remained seated, her gaze lost in the distance. Jack approached cautiously. "Are you okay, my girl?" Emily looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears, but also with a new determination. "Yes, Dad, I'm okay. In fact, I think I'm better than ever." "What did he say?" Jack asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Emily smiled weakly. "He asked for forgiveness. He explained how he felt during my coma, how lost and scared he was. It doesn't justify what he did, but I understand it a little better now." Jack sat next to his daughter, taking her hand in his. "And you, what do you feel?" "I feel peace," Emily responded after a moment of reflection. "I'm not going to lie, it still hurts. But I no longer feel that consuming anger. I think I've forgiven him, not for him, but for me." Jack felt a wave of pride for his daughter's maturity. "You're amazing, you know that?" Emily smiled, resting her head on her father's shoulder. "I learned from the best." Just at that moment, Michael appeared in the garden, clearly looking for them. Seeing the intimate scene between father and daughter, he hesitated, but Emily saw him and called him over with a gesture. "Michael," Emily said when the doctor approached, "do you have a moment? There's something I want to tell you both." Michael nodded, sitting on the other side of Emily. The young woman took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot lately about my life, about what I want for my future, and I've made a decision." Jack and Michael exchanged a look of concern. "I want to leave," Emily said firmly. "Not forever, but I need time to find myself, to heal completely, not just physically, but emotionally." "But Emily," Jack began, "I can continue my therapy elsewhere," Emily gently interrupted. "In fact, I've been researching. There's a rehabilitation center on the coast that has an excellent program. I think the change of environment would do me good." Michael, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke. "From a medical point of view, I think it could be beneficial for your recovery. But Emily, are you sure this is what you want? Emily nodded with determination. I'm sure I love you both more than I can express, but I need to do this for myself. Jack felt his heart shrink at the idea of separating from his daughter, but he knew he had to respect her decision. If this is what you need, we'll support you. Right, Michael? Michael nodded, although Jack could see the pain in his eyes. Of course, your well-being is the most important thing. Emily smiled, her eyes shining with tears of gratitude. Thank you both for understanding, for always supporting me. The three melted into a group hug, each struggling with their own emotions. Jack feeling that his daughter was truly growing up, Michael trying to reconcile his love for Emily with the need to let her go, and Emily grateful for the unconditional support, but eager to embark on her own path. In the weeks that followed, preparations for Emily's departure were set in motion. Jack took care of the logistical details, making sure his daughter had everything she needed for her stay at the rehabilitation center. Michael, for his part, took charge of coordinating with the doctors at the center to ensure the continuity of Emily's treatment. The night before Emily's departure, Jack organized a small farewell dinner at Mrs. Thompson's house. The atmosphere was bittersweet, joy for Emily's progress mixed with the sadness of the imminent separation. During dinner, Mrs. Thompson raised her glass for a toast to Emily. She said, with an emotional voice, "May this journey bring the peace and strength you seek unto all of us. May we learn to love by letting go." After dinner, while Emily was chatting with Mrs. Thompson, Jack and Michael found themselves alone on the balcony. "It's going to be hard, isn't it?" Jack said, looking out at the garden. Michael nodded. "More than I can express. But it's the right thing for her." Jack looked at his friend, noticing the conflict in his eyes. "Michael, I know you love my daughter, and I think she feels something for you too." "I know," Michael interrupted with a sad smile. "It's not the right time she needs to find herself first." Jack put a hand on Michael's shoulder. "You're a good man, Michael. Whatever happens, you'll always be part of our family." The next morning, everyone gathered at the airport to say goodbye to Emily. There were tears, hugs, and promises to stay in touch. When it finally came time for Emily to go through security, she turned one last time to her family. "I love you all," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for understanding, for supporting me. I'll be back soon, I promise." With one last hug for her father and a meaningful look at Michael, Emily walked away, ready to begin the next chapter of her life. As they watched her disappear into the crowd, Jack felt a mixture of pride and nostalgia. His little girl had become a strong and brave woman. Beside him, Michael struggled to contain his emotions, his eyes fixed on the spot where Emily had disappeared. Mrs. Thompson, always perceptive, took both men's hands. "Come, my dears," she said softly. "Emily has begun her journey. It's time for us to continue ours." The months that followed were a period of adjustment for everyone. Jack immersed himself in the work of the store, expanding the business to a third location. Michael dedicated himself to his work at the hospital with renewed vigor, initiating a healthcare program for homeless people in honor of Jack's story. Emily, for her part, flourished in her new environment. Her letters and calls were full of enthusiasm for her physical progress and the new friendships she was forming. She talked about long walks on the beach, revealing therapy sessions, an inner peace she was discovering. However, as time passed, Jack began to notice a subtle change in his daughter's communications. Her messages became less frequent, shorter. When they talked on the phone, Emily seemed distracted, as if she was hiding something. Worried, Jack shared his concerns with Michael and Mrs. Thompson one afternoon during their now traditional weekly tea. "I feel like there's something she's not telling me," Jack confessed. "Something has changed, I can feel it." Michael, who had also noticed the change, tried to reassure him. "Maybe she's just busy with her recovery, or perhaps she's making new friends, exploring new experiences." Mrs. Thompson, however, had a thoughtful look. "Or perhaps," she said slowly, "our Emily has found something more than peace at that center." Jack and Michael looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" Jack asked. "Well," Mrs. Thompson continued with an enigmatic smile, "Emily is a beautiful and charismatic young woman. It wouldn't be surprising if she's caught someone's attention there." The idea fell like a bomb in the room. Jack felt a mixture of concern and paternal protectiveness. Michael, for his part, struggled to maintain a neutral expression, although the pain was evident in his eyes. "But that's just a supposition," Mrs. Thompson quickly added, noticing the tension in the room. "The important thing is that Emily is well and happy." The following days were restless for Jack. Every time his phone rang, he hoped it was Emily. With some revelation, Michael, for his part, immersed himself even more in his work, as if trying to distract himself from his own thoughts. It was a week later when the call finally came that would change everything. Jack was closing the store when his phone rang. "It was Emily, Dad," she said, her voice a mixture of nervousness and excitement. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Jack felt his heart racing. "Of course, my girl. What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Emily spoke. "Dad, I've met someone here, someone special." Jack closed his eyes, bracing himself for what was to come. "Someone special," he repeated softly. "Yes," Emily continued, her voice gaining confidence. "His name is Tom. He's a therapist here at the center, Dad. He understands me in a way that no one else has. He makes me feel whole." Jack listened in silence as his daughter told him about Tom, about how they had met, how their friendship had transformed into something deeper. He could hear the happiness in Emily's voice, a happiness he hadn't heard in a long time. "He sounds wonderful, my girl," Jack finally said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I'm happy for you." "Thank you, Dad," Emily responded, relief evident in her voice. "There's something else. Tom and I are thinking of moving in together when I finish my treatment. He has a job offer in the city and I think I'm ready to start a new chapter in my life." Jack felt the world wobbling beneath his feet. His daughter, his little Emily, had not only found love, but was planning a life with someone else, someone he didn't even know. That's great news, Emily," Jack managed to say. "I'm very happy for you. I really am." After exchanging a few more words and promises to talk soon, Jack hung up the phone. He stood there in the middle of his darkened store, feeling that the world had irrevocably changed. With trembling hands, he dialed Michael's number. When his friend answered, Jack could only say, "We need to talk. It's about Emily." What Jack didn't know was that this revelation would be just the beginning of a series of events that would test family ties, love, and loyalty in ways that none of them could have imagined. Emily's return with Tom would unleash a storm of emotions and long-held secrets that would threaten everything they had built. The days that followed, Emily's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for everyone involved. Jack struggled with conflicting feelings, joy for his daughter's happiness, concern about this new relationship, and a deep sense of loss as he realized that his little girl had truly grown up. Michael, for his part, sank into a melancholic silence. Although he tried to maintain a facade of support and happiness for Emily, his eyes betrayed the pain of an unrealized love. Mrs. Thompson, always the voice of reason, kept everyone grounded, reminding them that Emily's love for them hadn't diminished. It had only expanded to include someone new. Finally, the day of Emily's return arrived. Jack, Michael, and Mrs. Thompson waited anxiously at the airport, each dealing with their own expectations and fears. When Emily appeared at the arrivals gate, the change in her was evident. Not only did she look healthier and stronger physically, but she radiated a confidence and serenity they hadn't seen before. By her side walked a tall, kind-looking man whom Jack assumed was Tom. "Dad!" Emily cried, now running without the need for a cane, to embrace Jack. "I've missed you all so much." After an emotional reunion filled with hugs and tears of joy, Emily formally introduced Tom. "Family, this is Tom. This is my family. My father Jack, my adopted grandmother Mrs. Thompson, and Michael, my best friend." Tom greeted everyone with genuine warmth that, despite his initial reservations, Jack couldn't help but appreciate. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you all," Tom said. "Emily has told me so much about you that I feel like I already know you." The days that followed were a period of adjustment for everyone. Emily and Tom temporarily settled into Jack's house while they looked for their own place. The family dynamic subtly changed with Tom's presence, and everyone was trying to find their new place in this configuration. One night, while Emily and Tom had gone out to dinner, Jack found himself alone with Michael on the terrace of his house. "How are you really?" Jack asked his friend. The sadness in his eyes evident. Michael sighed deeply. "Honestly, I'm heartbroken, but I'm also happy for her. It's complicated." Jack nodded understandingly. "I know part of me wants to hate Tom for taking my little girl away, but I can't. He's a good man, and he makes Emily happy." "That's the problem," Michael said with a sad smile. "It's hard to hate someone who clearly loves Emily as much as we do." Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Emily and Tom were having their own important conversation. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Tom asked, taking Emily's hand across the table at the restaurant. Emily nodded with determination. "I'm sure they've been my family, my support for so long. They deserve to know the truth." The next day, Emily gathered everyone in Jack's living room. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone wondered what news this family meeting would bring. "Family," Emily began, her voice trembling slightly. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have shared a long time ago." Everyone held their breath, expecting the worst. "I'm pregnant," Emily blurted out. 3 months along. The room fell silent for a moment before erupting into a cacophony of reactions. Jack sat open-mouthed, unable to process the news. Michael visibly paled while Mrs. Thompson let out a cry of joy. But how Jack began, his mind spinning. "Is it safe with your condition?" "It's completely safe," Tom assured, taking Emily's hand. "We've been closely monitoring the pregnancy from the beginning. Emily and the baby are perfectly healthy." "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" Michael asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily lowered her gaze, ashamed. "I was afraid of disappointing you, of you thinking I was making a mistake. I needed time to process everything myself first." Jack slowly stood up from his chair and approached his daughter. For a moment, everyone held their breath, waiting for his reaction. Then, to everyone's surprise, including his own, Jack enveloped Emily in a tight hug. "My girl," he said in a choked voice, "you could never disappoint me. I'm so proud of you." Tears began to flow freely as one by one, everyone joined the hug. Even Michael, overcoming his initial pain, came forward to congratulate the couple. "You're going to be a wonderful mother," he said, his voice full of genuine emotion. Despite the pain in his eyes, Mrs. Thompson, always the voice of reason and celebration, declared that this deserved a party. "I'm going to be a great grandmother," she exclaimed with joy. "This deserves a feast." The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. Emily and Tom found a small apartment near Jack's house. Michael, demonstrating admirable strength of character, offered to be Emily's primary care physician during the pregnancy. Jack, for his part, immersed himself in his new role as grandfather with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, even himself. He spent hours in his store selecting the best products for Emily, ensuring she had a perfectly balanced diet. He also began transforming a room in his house into a nursery, insisting that the baby would need a place to stay when visiting Grandpa. As Emily's belly grew, so did the love and unity of this peculiar family. Tom, far from being an intruder, integrated perfectly into the family dynamic. His kindness and dedication to Emily won over even the initially wary Jack. One afternoon, while Emily was resting, Jack and Tom found themselves working together on the nursery. "You know," Jack began as he painted a wall a soft yellow color, "when Emily first told us about you, I was terrified." Tom, who was assembling a crib, looked up in surprise. "Really? I never would have guessed," Jack smiled. "I'm good at hiding my emotions, but yes, I was scared. I thought you were coming to take my little girl away." "And instead," Tom said, leaving the phrase hanging. "And instead," Jack continued, "you brought more love to our family. You make my daughter happy, Tom, and for that I'll always be grateful to you." The two men shared a look of mutual understanding, the bond between them strengthening even more. Meanwhile, Michael struggled with his own demons. Seeing Emily happy with another man was painful, but the real challenge came when he began to develop feelings for one of the nurses at the hospital. Sophie. He felt guilty, as if he were betraying his feelings for Emily. It was Mrs. Thompson who finally helped him overcome this emotional crisis. One afternoon, as they were having tea in her garden, the wise old woman said to him, "Michael, my dear, the heart has an infinite capacity to love. Loving someone new doesn't diminish the love you felt or feel for Emily. It only means that your heart is healing, growing." Those words were a turning point for Michael. Little by little, he began to allow himself to explore his feelings for Sophie, discovering a new happiness he didn't believe possible. The big day arrived on a warm spring morning. Emily went into labor, and the whole family mobilized to the hospital. The hours passed in a mixture of anxiety and excitement. Jack paced back and forth in the waiting room, while Mrs. Thompson prayed silently, and Michael constantly monitored the progress of the labor. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a baby's cry was heard. Minutes later, Tom came out of the delivery room with tears of joy in his eyes. "It's a girl," he announced, his voice full of emotion. "Emily and the baby are perfect." The joy that flooded the room was indescribable. Hugs, tears, and congratulations mixed in an explosion of pure happiness. When they were finally able to enter to see Emily and the newborn, the scene they found melted their hearts. Emily, although exhausted, radiated a serene happiness as she held her daughter in her arms. "Family," she said softly, "I'd like you to meet Eleanor Jacqueline." Mrs. Thompson choked back a sob at hearing the name, and Jack felt his heart swell with pride and love. "She's perfect," Jack whispered, gently touching his granddaughter's tiny hand. "She is," Emily agreed, looking around at the people she loved. "And she has the best family a girl could ask for." At that moment, looking at his daughter holding his granddaughter, surrounded by the people who had become his family by choice, Jack felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road had been long and often difficult, filled with challenges and moments of doubt. But every step, every obstacle overcome had led them to this perfect moment. He remembered that day years ago, when he had helped an unknown elderly woman in a restaurant. He never would have imagined that that simple act of kindness would trigger a series of events that would change his life forever. As he held little Eleanor in his arms for the first time, Jack knew with certainty that it had all been worth it. The struggles, the tears, the moments of despair, it had all been part of a journey that had led them to this instant of pure joy. And so, in that hospital room, surrounded by love and new beginnings, Jack, Emily, Tom, Michael, and Mrs. Thompson, this family, forged not by blood but by love and circumstances, found themselves looking towards a bright future full of possibilities. Little Eleanor Jacqueline, with her arrival, had sealed the bonds that united them, reminding them that love in all its forms is the most powerful force in the universe, and that sometimes the strongest families are those we choose to create. As the sun set over the city, bathing the hospital room in a warm golden glow, they all shared a look of silent understanding. They had weathered storms together, had laughed, cried, and grown as a unit. And now, with this new life in their hands, they were ready to face any challenge the future might bring, because in the end that's what it means to be a family, to be there for each other in good times and bad, united by a love that transcends blood and time. And so, with little Eleanor as their new center, this extraordinary family began the next chapter of their story, secure in the knowledge that no matter what happens, they would always have each other.